Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's Brian, and this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things pertaining to the Christian faith.
Wow, I've won you over. I've made a convert.
It's acquiescence.
I've gone over hill and dale to make a convert to whatever.
A convert to what, Brian?
To pertaining.
Language to pertaining. All right.
We're back. My pretentiousness.
Your pretentiousness. Yes. You've won me over. Hint, hint. Wink, wink.
It wasn't
all right.
hard.
Well, Brian, we're back. Spring is springing upon us.
Yes.
We're
in Holy Week. We're in Holy Week. Yesterday was when we're recording this. Yesterday was Palm Sunday, and next week will be the Blessed Easter.
Again, just to give you, for those of you who are doing the math, just to give you a glimpse about how far in advance we're working here. It is 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we are recording this for tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, we usually are a little bit ahead, but not right now. It's been a busy season. But we got some good. We have some good stuff for you today. We're excited about this stuff today.
Well, Brian, do you want to tell everybody what you're doing that's making you a little busy too?
Well, no. I mean, it's just a pastor's busy schedule on Holy Week. You know, we do a Monday, Thursday service, which is a lot of congregations don't necessarily do that. And so I'm excited for that. It's going to be a little bit of a different service this week. And so been a lot of preparations for that. And then, just the Easter week is just, there's always lots going on.
There's a lot happening there. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, tell us, we're having an episode today, which is kind of divided a little bit. We're actually covering a couple different topics, but I'm excited about this first one.
Okay.
I mean, I'm excited for both of them, but lay it on us what we're talking about here.
Well, we're going to talk about something that's more of a current event a little bit later, and I think it's really exciting, and it is going to be worth hanging around to the end. Even if you don't like this first part, wait, there's something completely different coming.
Boring.
But I also did think I want to acknowledge this is coming out Holy Week, and we always try to do something that's related to that. And so I thought today there's a character in the account in the Gospel of John. Actually, he's in all four accounts. He's only named in John's account, and we'll get to this, but he has a minor role in this whole story, but I think there's some interesting things. He's only mentioned by name in one verse in the entire New Testament. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how much we can learn and think about the setting and the situation just given that. So here's how I'd like to do this. He is mentioned, even though I said he's only mentioned by name in one verse in the entire New Testament in the Gospel of John, he's mentioned in all four Gospels. This story is mentioned in all four Gospels. And who we're talking about is the servant of the high priest who is present in the Garden of Gethsemane when Judas betrays Jesus and when the temple guards come to arrest him. So what I want to do is I want to start back in Mark and read. We're going to do this in the canonical order: Matthew, Mark. I'm sorry, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to do it in the what many people believe is the order in which they were written: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John. And I want you to notice kind of the progression here, and we'll talk about a couple of different ways to understand it. So let's start with Mark chapter 14:47. I think you pulled that up for us, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Here we go. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear.
Okay, so when they're coming to arrest Jesus, there's this detail given that one of those near, he's not named, but he draws a sword. It's interesting in Luke, and this is just one of those minor details I always find really interesting. In Luke, Jesus is basically saying there's a time coming where things are going to become very difficult for you. And he uses a figurative way to say this. He says, I told you in the past only to take don't take anything else with you. Now I'm telling you, you better go sell your cloak and buy a sword. It's going to become a very difficult time. And so the disciples in their typical, I was going to say sharp-wittedness, but that'd be kind of a pun. But in their failure to understand exactly what Jesus is trying to say to them, says, "Oh, look, here are two swords. We already have two swords. We're kind of ready to go." So one of those, we find out in the upper room with Jesus, had a sword with him, not named here, takes it off, cuts off the high priest's ear. Now I want you to go ahead and read. I didn't tell you to do this, but go ahead and read the next verse where Jesus responds to this. See what he says in response to this.
Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me?
So
keep going?
That's fine. So basically, he is saying, what he gets accused of falsely is leading an insurrection or a rebellion against the Roman government, and that's what the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders of the time, are trying to pin on Jesus. That's the accusation they bring against Pilate, and there's several reasons I can think that. We don't have to talk about them today, but basically, Jesus says, "I'm not going to be doing an insurrection." That's all we have in Mark. Okay, now go ahead and read Matthew chapter 26. Verses 50 and 51, if you would. And I may have you read some more of this too.
Yeah. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then
this is talking to Judas. I should give you some context here.
Yeah. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus's companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear.
Okay, so both of them give just that detail, that somebody, a disciple of Jesus, a companion, somebody who was standing there, draws a sword, not named in either Mark or Matthew, cuts off the ear. Now, what's Jesus' response here? What does he say here?
"Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." Okay,
so basically this is not how I want my followers to do this. He's rebuking. In both cases, he rebukes essentially this action. Now, let's move to Luke 22, and we get a little bit more detail in the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah. But Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him.
Okay, so this is the first of the accounts. If the traditional order of Matthew or Mark, Matthew, and Luke is correct, this is the first account where we find that Jesus heals the ear of the servant of the high priest who was cut off. Again, he's not named. The disciple who did the cutting is not named. All three accounts, what I want you to notice is Jesus rebukes the action, though. In all three of them, he rebukes it. Now, let me stop here before we go to the John account and say that one of the ways that this has traditionally been understood is that as stories go later in time, they accrue additional details. In other words, there are some people who would say that the further you move from the origins of a story, you get these little details that make it seem like it has, we call it verisimilitude. It makes it look like it's something that was seen. And so that's kind of, I shouldn't say that's the only way this has been understood, but one of the main streams of thought in this is that's what's going on here. The later we get, the more that details have accrued. Now, I've said before, I don't necessarily think that the traditional way that the Gospels came to us, again, thinking that they're in this chronological order, and especially that there's no conversation going on between each of the Gospel writers. I don't think that's correct. Tom N.T. Wright in his New Testament People of God, and then in his Jesus and the Gospels, both of these massive books, especially the introduction to Jesus and the Gospels, makes this argument for kind of an interaction, so that this kind of explains why we have various gospel writers emphasizing various details. And certainly, as we've said before, the synoptic picture is a very similar picture, but I don't think we can clearly separate or delineate between these traditions and say, well, Mark came first and he never spoke to Matthew, right? And then Matthew wrote and he never spoke to Luke. And then Luke, you get what I'm saying is I don't think that's a good way to understand this entire story. Now, and in fact, well, I don't know if I'm going to bring this up or not. Now, let me read the part in John. One thing that's important to notice, I think, before we go on, and I'll come back to this. Again, Jesus rebukes the action of his disciple in all three of the accounts we've seen so far. Now, here's John's account. This is in John chapter 18, and I'm going to begin, I think, in verse 10. Well, let me go a little bit further because we talked about the Judas action here. So Jesus basically, Judas comes and he says, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." In John's account, there's this really interesting thing that takes place where he says, "I am," and they all fall back on the ground. And then he asks him again, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, I told you I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go." In other words, he's trying to protect his disciples. And he goes on, it's similar to what he said in the upper room when he said, "I will have lost none of those that the Lord, that God gave me." And it says this then, in verse 10, this is where we get to the action. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. And then in the NIV, at least, this is a parenthetical statement. The servant's name was Malchus. And then here's Jesus' reaction. Jesus commanded, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father's given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its command and its Jewish officials arrested Jesus, bound him, so forth. So a couple of interesting details we get here in Luke. Luke is the one who tells us that Jesus heals Malchus's ear, although the other three don't mention it. But this story, it's remarkable in a couple ways. First of all, it's a minor detail. I understand that. But it occurs in all four of the gospel accounts. And you know, even the most ardent critics of the Gospels, those who are trying, you might remember the Jesus seminar from a few years back. I mean, they're kind of passé now, but that kind of an argumentation of saying which of the stories are accurate in the Gospels and which are not, there are a couple of different criteria that this one fits. First is the criterion that it's attested in multiple traditions. In other words, all four Gospel writers record this, which give it a higher sense of credibility. The other one, though, is this. There's a criterion they call the criterion of embarrassment. And that means it's very unusual for a group like Christians, let's say early Christians, to include stories within their sacred writings that would be embarrassing to people like the apostles or to other early adherents in their own community. So here, it's an embarrassing story, right? Jesus rebukes the action in all four cases. In other words, the disciples, and we find out at the end, his name is Simon Peter. Peter is acting in an inappropriate way, and Jesus rebukes him. So there's the criterion of embarrassment. Both of these would say that this has to be an authentic account. Now we get to this idea of anonymity. Early in again, if we think Matthew, Mark, and Luke are earlier, which I think so, I think John is written later. I don't think it's written as late as some other, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if they're writing earlier, he's anonymous. Malchus is not named by name there, and neither is Simon Peter, I'll mention. Now, nobody thinks that Simon Peter was an invention here, right? But then in John, we have both Simon Peter and Malchus named. And I'm going to mention a scholar by the name of Richard Bauckham in a book that he wrote that's been very influential. I've actually mentioned it a couple of times on the podcast.
And it's not a book for the faint of heart.
It's yes. Have you read it? I can't remember if you've read it.
I've read portions of it.
It's I would call it a middle of the road book. It's not super hard.
And there's a lot to get through.
There's a lot of detail. And it's not, the other interesting thing about it is they're each written kind of as separate articles. You don't have to really follow the entire argument of the entire book, which I think makes it a little bit easier. But there's a chapter he wrote about this idea of anonymity in the Gospels. Have you read that chapter? Mm-mm. And basically he makes the point, and Gerd Tyson, a German scholar, thinks the same thing. So they agree on this, that anonymity may have been for the protection of the actual person if that person was an early Christian. Because both of them think that the synoptic tradition, at least the synoptic stories that are being gathered together, again, think about the N.T. Wright model. These are kind of stories that are being told from one person to another, from one community or one group to another, probably being preached. You know, we have evidence in the early church that the apostles were preaching and telling the story. You know, central to their teaching was who is Jesus, and talking through the story and giving eyewitness accounts. As they're doing this, if they're doing it within a context early, before Christianity is considered to be a legatio religio, you know, a legal religion, then it's very possible that to be named in a document like this that could be found would have been a dangerous situation. So Bauckham and Tyson both make the argument that maybe that this suggests to us that Malchus was an early Christian, that even though he was a servant of the high priest, after Jesus healed him, he became a believer, right? After he had been literally touched by Jesus, and seen the events of his arrest, seen the way that Jesus reacted even, that he maybe allowed them to take him, and watched the events. He would have had a front row seat to the trial. And imagine that in all of this, after having received his touch and been healed and knew for sure Jesus' healing power, to then watch all of the trial and all the things that they're trying to accuse him of, to see the way that he responds, and then to hear stories of his resurrection, I think there's a very good chance that Malchus became a Christian. Now, not only do I think that, but there are some relatively early traditions in the church fathers that make reference to Malchus as a believer, as someone who became a believer. Again, we don't take that on its own, but then taken together with all the rest of this, I think that may be what's going on. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today and to think about as we think about Holy Week. It's very interesting, and this is actually where I think it relates to what we're getting ready to talk about, is that Jesus said to his disciples a couple things. He said, first of all, don't live by this, those who are going to live by the sword will die by the sword. But he had warned them. If you look at John's account in the upper room discourse, Jesus had warned his disciples that they were going to be persecuted, that they were going to be imprisoned, that they were going to be beaten, that everything that happened to Jesus was also going to happen to them. And he kind of summarizes it by saying, don't be surprised if the world hates you. Remember that it hated me first, right? The follower of Jesus is going to receive persecution because I'm using world here in the sense of those who've, as John does, the enemies of God's people, those who've rejected the Messiah are going to respond to their disciples in the same kind of way. And so in the early church, we see this example, and we'll mention an early church quotation a little bit later that talks about this idea. And so Bauckham, his thesis is that when we find an anonymous character in the gospel that in a later gospel, becomes named, that probably isn't adding detail, but it simply might be a matter that they went from a position of danger into a position later when Christianity would have been more accepted and when they could have been named, given a proper name. And the other thing is, he thinks that being named, Clopas is another example where you have, him being named. There are other examples that we could give. He gives devotes a whole chapter to this, obviously. But the interesting thing going along with that, in my opinion, then, is that it would also be meaningful if these were leaders in the early church. Certainly Peter's a leader in the early church. If Malchus, let's say, became a pastor, evangelist, or some kind of leader within the early church, we could imagine them mentioning him by name having an import for those who would have known his role in the early church community as well. So any thoughts on that? I know that was kind of a diatribe that I gave.
No, it's cool. I mean, it's one of those things where there's been so much research and done and so forth and stuff that, it's hard for us, I think, to see that if you're just reading John's account to go like, oh, here's his detail and what's different. But I think it's really interesting just to see that progression through some of those books, some more detail. And it's an interesting thing to think about that he could have become a Christian, and the reason now that it would have been a little bit safer for him to do so.
Well, and he even, when he talks about eyewitnesses, he even says sometimes naming these people by name as eyewitnesses might be a way to lend credibility to the stories. This is Bauckham.
Because John's all about testimony, right?
Eyewitnesses, I think so.
Eyewitness and testimony. So that's interesting. And I think it's also when we think about how unique these, for some people, like the gospel having those different accounts it's a problem, but kind of going like
there may be a reason for it, right?
There's a reason for it. Yeah. There could be an absolutely valid reason that they're like that.
So it's an interesting thought, and I'll just mention. I quote Bauckham's book all the time. I quote it most frequently when you've heard me say that the majority of young Judean boys were named after one of the Maccabean kings in the first century. That's Bauckham's, and you talk about exhaustive research. He basically looked at all the documentation in order to find out what names were being used for Jewish young men in the first century, and again, that's, I can basically give his thesis in one sentence, but it does take a lot of wading through to get through the evidence. But nerds like you and I really like to see. We have to show us your homework. Show us your work.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the those names are an important thing for what we call textual criticism. How do we know, like, some of these Gnostic gospels or some of these other things that sometimes people say are hidden, but you look at the names, and this is one of those things, again, you're going to go like, these names are not from this region or from this time. And so this is not, this document, this manuscript does not work with the rest of Scripture. So interesting.
Well, that's your nice. That's your little thought for Holy Week this week. Put away your swords and follow Jesus in laying down, taking on, as we've talked about the cruciform life.
Yeah.
So here's the other thing we thought about. There's kind of been a conflation of three different sources that have come to us, or three different studies that have come to us from different sources. We'll talk about, and all of them I would call encouraging. All of them are encouraging accounts. So,
yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we've been talking about here for a little bit, and we've had Ryan Burge on here before. He's kind of a statistician. He wrote a book called The Nuns, and this is been
kind of coined that term. He's
Nuns,
famous for coining the term The Nuns.
Yes.
Right?
The Nuns,
not the N-U-Ns, as he always likes to say.
No, he did not coin that one. We've had him on here, and we've also referenced a podcast, and we've had Justin Brierley on here. He wrote
Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God.
Belief in God. He wrote a book by that title, and there's also a podcast.
Yep.
And so this is kind of like this convergence of all of these things kind of coming together.
We've had Chad Ragsdale on. We'll mention him in just a minute. He's been on before, and you liked his. You really enjoy his Twitter feed and his social media.
I love that Twitter feed.
He can get a little spicy from time to time, but he kind of lays it down and sells it like it is. So we appreciate Chad. We need to have Chad back on.
I think that's kind of a theologian thing, isn't it? To get a little spicy on social media these days.
Maybe
there's a couple of them out there.
Yeah, let's not discuss that.
Let's not discuss that. Anyway,
we don't want to either put any fuel on that fire or bring any attention.
Yes. Well, today one of the things we're talking about today is there seems to be, just like Justin Brierley had kind of talked about, the surprising birth of belief in God, that there seems to be some surveys and some things coming out that seem to show like that there's some movement here, that this is not a vain theory. So
again, his book title kind of says it all, but he believes that we may be seeing a resurgence of the traditional Christian faith and a move away. Particularly, he began thinking about this, but he's gone on beyond this. Talked about the new atheist movement and how it's kind of become bankrupt for many people, and they're moving away from that, and there does seem to be a resurgence of belief in some unlikely places. That's what I think the other thing that kind of brings us together. So he's the one actually. It came across. I subscribe to his. I actually support his work because I think he does some very good work and it's important. But in his email that he sends out regularly to supporters, he, by the way, speaking of which, if you like something, you should support it. But I'll leave that to the side. But he sent out his email, and he has an interview with a lady who's the director of research of the UK Bible Society, and they've just put a recent story out, and there's a book along with it, and we'll quote the author of the book in a minute. The book's called The Quiet Revival, and basically they're saying there's a revival taking place in particularly the places they surveyed in this is England and Wales. As somebody who's lived there, they're saying leave Scotland on its own. It's a unique place. To quote King James in Braveheart, the only problem with Scotland is there's simply too many Scots. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Gotcha.
So anyway, but in England and Wales, I just had to stick that in. In England and Wales, there has been a resurgence of church attendance, particularly here's the unexpected thing, among Gen Z, among the younger generation of people. And here's I'll just read you the subtitle. Again, all these titles really kind of give away the whole story. Church decline in England and Wales has not only stopped, but the church is growing as Gen Z leads an exciting turnaround in church attendance. So I found that really interesting. He interviews, speaking of Scots, this is a very Celtic name, Dr. Rhiannon MacAleer, which is, you can't get much more Celtic than that, director of research for the Bible Society. Do you want to give some of the stats, or do you want me to go ahead and just talk about this?
So one of the things they've talked about here is, and this is a lot of this has to do with young men and women, but young men church attendance has grown, and I think the last survey they did, it's from 2018 to the present, has grown from 4% to 21%.
And that's kind of the current, the most recent survey that's been done. So that's a 500% increase in a number of, just 7 years or something like that, which is just remarkable.
And COVID's in the midst of this. Which
was an anomaly. And church attendance, of course, went to basically nil, especially in places like the UK, where there were some pretty draconian laws that were given.
But you had plenty of time to think for yourself. So that might have had something to do with it as well. But also then for young women, it's gone from 3% to 12%, a 400% increase.
And so that's two of the studies we're going to quote, one from the UK and one from the US. One of the surprising parts of this is that it's focused particularly on young men who've kind of traditionally been seen as the harder group to reach when it comes to church attendance. So that's the only, we're not trying to be sexist or anything, but it's just an interesting part of this whole movement is that it seems to be centered for whatever reason around young men. I thought this quote was interesting. This is from, I mentioned that book, The Quiet Revival, which is, this survey is a part of it, and there's other things that they've done in that. One of the co-authors is Dr. Rob Barward-Simmons with a Y. Speaking of, I said a very Celtic name. That's a very English name. That's a very proper English name. Rob, I'm sure his name is Robert, or maybe Robin, I don't know, but Rob Barward-Simmons. We'll have to get him on here and ask.
Yeah, we will, just for his name. And then thank you. Thank you for coming.
He says that one possible reason for church growth was that people were looking for meaning. And here's the quote, with much of the population, he's talking here again about England and Wales, much of the population struggling with mental health, loneliness, and a loss of meaning in life, in particular young people, church appears to be offering an answer. And then here's his further statement. We found that churchgoers are more likely than non-churchgoers to report higher life satisfaction. And I've seen earlier surveys that suggested that. But what's interesting here is young people seem to be taking that on board and responding. Greater feeling of connection to their community than non-churchgoers, less likely to report frequently feeling anxious or depressed. And he said in the surveys, particularly among young women. So he gives some of the reasons for that they're looking for meaning, which we've talked about. And that's one of the things Brierley in his podcast hits frequently, some of these. And he's typically interviewing older people. He has a couple of younger people, but typically these are kind of older people who've gone through their careers and been almost, adamant atheist at times, and who have come to the faith. And he, again, as we mentioned already, he's kind of been predicting this, and these may be some signs, some initial, they're hopeful at least, hopefully they continue and we see that going on.
Yeah. And this reminds me a little bit, we had Dr. Andrew Root on here as well.
Yes,
and he was talking about, and I think this is really an important thing, we've kind of hit around this, is that there, as we think about this mental health and loneliness and loss of meaning in life, that the church, they're finding answers in the church. And so it's not, and Andrew Root's kind of premise is it's not about our programming.
Yeah.
It's not about the band. It's not about but it's about finding connections to Christ, and in that community, having connections to each other. And that's where the life is. The life isn't in our programming. Yeah. The life isn't in, we've got these classes or that. It's about connection to Christ and connection to each other.
He mentions foregrounding that story of Jesus, and particularly how has Jesus impacted your life, like foregrounding those things, being willing to tell one another these stories. And I mentioned the cruciform life, and he's big on that as well. We talked about that in terms of Malchus, right? This idea that Jesus commands his followers, he says, if you will be my followers, you will take up your cross and follow me, right? So we are to inhabit that cross-centered life where we're willing to sacrifice on behalf of another person. And I think people see that, and it makes an impact, has an impact on them. Now, I'd mentioned this. I'd mentioned one person in particular. I don't know that I'll mention him. I'll leave that to you. But Brierley, several of the people he's interviewed, it's almost like Christianity has become the last choice. Like they try everything else, right?
Yes.
And you mentioned that he calls it kind of what you said, an inoculation.
So Brierley, when we talked to him about it, is that especially in England, and I think this is actually true in the United States as well.
Yes, it's getting at least getting that way.
It's getting that way. In England, when they were growing up, there was. You had a class, it's Church of England.
Yeah.
You're going to learn a little bit about faith. And oftentimes, I'm guessing it was not a very good representation. It could have been.
What the
but
character
when you're kids,
characters like a young Anglican priest with a guitar coming in to singing some hokey songs and that kind of thing. So,
but that there was this sense of someone had a taste of it as a kid. Yeah, I know what it is. Forget it. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so then when they're searching for something, the last thing they think about is this kind of deformed view they might have had, particularly to begin with.
Right.
And so the last thing they check out is Christianity.
And then one of them mentioned it was right there on the corner the whole time, and here I walk in and you're right. I do think we see some of that in the U.S. One of the things you've heard me say before, and I like to say, is usually when somebody's rejected Christianity, if you dig deep enough, what you find is they've not really rejected a profound and deep understanding of the Christian faith. They have rejected surface level actions of people that they don't care about, or their perception of the church sometimes is uncaring, or these kind of things are what ends up to rejection of Christianity rather than really a deep understanding. And this can be shown by Brierley. He's interviewing in his podcast, and again, I can't recommend his podcast highly enough. He's interviewing these people who are experts in their field. We're talking about leading scientists, literary critics, people, philosophers, people in all kinds of areas who went through a stage of profound rejection of Christianity, but now find themselves in a place where they're recognizing that there's something here that is even intellectually satisfying in a way that other worldviews aren't.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's an important point, that it's intellect. It is not a jettison of their intellect that has drawn them to faith. It is like, in some ways, now their intellect might have been a hindrance to them coming around to this, but like once they found it, they're like, I don't have to jettison my brain to come to this conclusion.
It's not that kind of caricature you get of somebody on their deathbed, grasping for some kind of maybe hope of an afterlife. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who've really thoughtfully come to appreciate aspects of the Christian faith. Tom Holland we could talk about, and there are lots of interesting things going on with that, and we'll mention some other things in relation to that. So here's the second. So we said there's three strains. The first one is this report that comes out of the Bible Society of the UK. Second one's from Barna, one of the leading statistical organizations, groups in the U.S. that do all kinds of surveys in different areas. But one of the areas that they're constantly surveying and looking at is Christianity. And they had some interesting recently, and this is where, thanks to Chad Ragsdale for pointing out this report to us. But their latest data says that 66% of all U.S. adults say they have made a personal commitment to Jesus that is important to their life today. So, in other words, they made a real life decision. This isn't just a matter, I call myself a Christian. This isn't nominal. And it continues to have an important role in my life today. 66%. And that's up significantly, even from, was it a 12% increase since 2021? So, just really, now, I did look at the whole thing, and I'll say we're not yet back to 2010 levels, but it is a sharp increase from 2021 to the present, to the latest study that was done in 2025.
Yeah, and kind of going along with that is kind of coming back to Ryan Burge. He recently went through some data, and basically it is showing that the nuns, there used to, when we talked, Ryan, there was just this ever increasing amount of nuns that have continue to rise.
Yeah.
But in the latest cooperative election study, that there really is a plateau, and it actually has dropped in some of these areas.
And it was surprising to Burge, right, as a sociologist who he puts out tons of these kind of graphs. That's kind of what he's known for, and he's really become a leading voice in a lot of ways in the sociological study of Christianity and religion in general, but Christianity particularly in the United States. So we've had him on a couple of times, 2 times or 3 times. We should get him back on if we
2 times. He just has another book out. We should.
Yeah, if he'll answer our calls. He's probably too big now. He won't answer our calls.
We got him on the infant stage, and now he's too big for the Bistro.
So Chad Ragsdale also mentioned to us and I think he actually mentioned this in the episode he was on, a book called Exiles in Babylon? Is that the title?
Faith for Exiles.
Faith for Exiles, that's it. And he talks about digital Babylon. That's the kind of the subtitle. But yeah, Faith for Exiles by David Kinnaman, who is the CEO of Barna. And I have a quote here that I thought was interesting here. He said, "It's undeniable there is a renewed interest in Jesus. Many people have predicted the growing irrelevance of Christianity. However, this data shows that spiritual trends have a dynamism and can indeed change. This is the clearest trend we've seen in more than a decade, pointing to spiritual renewal. First time Barna has recorded such spiritual interest being led by younger generations." And that's the other thing. Same thing we saw in the UK. We have evidence that it is Gen Z, and particularly, again, surprisingly, it is young men in Generation Z that are committing to Jesus Christ. It mentioned that their commitment jumped 15% from 2019 to 2025. Millennial men as well, but Gen Z. I looked at my own generation, Gen X. Of course, we're just flat because, I mean, meh.
Yeah, I mean, you're just there.
That's
right?
the statement of our generation, right? Meh.
Boomers. Okay. Then after that, it's just millennials and Zs.
You left us out again. You left Gen X out. So.
I know. That's what I'm saying. It's like right. Yep, that happened. I'm teasing, of course. And then third, what's the third here?
So this actually comes from a listener of our podcast who also happens to be a member of my congregation. So thank you very much to her for sending this study. And this is just, I think she sent this morning, if I remember correctly, and I shot it to you because it's a part of something you and I have discussed in the past. And it is a report that is being given, and Voice of the Martyrs is an organization that particularly tries to reach out and to advocate on behalf of those who are in Christians who are in difficult countries where Christianity is illegal, where they're facing difficulties. But there was a interview with him, and it's being reported by him and others that Iran has one of the fastest growing Christian populations in the world right now. Despite it being a completely underground movement, it being illegal to proselytize, it being illegal to distribute Christian materials in Iran, several under the regime there right now, which is an Islamicist regime, there is a growing interest and people converting to Christianity, interestingly enough. And the report from this person who's in the Voice of the Martyrs reports that 1 million Muslims are leaving Islam for Christianity in Iran. Another person was mentioning 50 to 75,000 mosques are closing. So it's not only Christianity, by the way, but there are people who are simply leaving Islam for nothing as well, to use the nuns kind of an idea. So I found that an interesting statistic that among Muslims, again, unexpected place, that Christianity seems to be taking on a growing importance, a growing role.
Yeah, it seems it's kind of it seems to be a trend whenever Christianity tries to be stamped out or stomped out, that it finds a way of.
And they mentioned this, that they're arresting leaders within the church. They're, a lot of these are underground churches, so they're house churches, they're Bible study leaders, and they're arresting them, they're beating them. What they said is the eyewitness account here is that they'll arrest them, they'll photograph everybody in the Bible study, but then they'll take the leader and they'll put him in prison. But despite that, it continues to grow. And it also, the article, I by the way, think that check out our show notes for this one, because I'm assuming we're going to have all kinds of links
we'll
to some of these things in there. But there's a link from this initial study, from this initial story, I guess I should say, that talks about now I forgot what I was going to say. Talks about some of those
that they're having visions.
Oh, well, that's another story we're going to, go ahead and talk about that. So we've mentioned this before. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that's been interesting for this, and we've talked about this a little bit before, and I think we might have talked about on the podcast in the past, that there's this growing trend of, and I don't want to say the word trend. Trend's not the right word.
Right.
But there's these accounts of people in these countries having visions and dreams of Jesus.
We're talking about Muslim people. We're talking about over a large period of time and over several different countries where these visions and dreams are taking place, where they're basically leading people to faith in Christ through vision. Interesting thing for us is, we're in the West. We tend to be kind of a rationalist. And, when you first hear these, your first intention is kind of like, or your first, if you're like me, your first response is maybe like, I don't know, maybe. But you and I have also been reading together this book called The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser, who I think passed away just in the last year or two. But The Unseen Realm, and that's one of the things he says is if we really look at our Bibles, if we really are going to use them for a foundation for our faith, you see some things in there that are different than a rationalistic Western, scientific worldview, which is the water we swim in. It's the social imaginary in which we find ourselves, is this kind of incredulity toward the supernatural. Ironically, we affirm we believe in the Spirit of Holy Spirit. We believe in God. We have all these things, and yet there are many aspects of the faith that we sometimes have a hard time grappling with, I think.
Yeah, it's hard for us. I think that's an understatement. Is like for us to sometimes live in the reality that the spiritual reality, in light of the spirituality. It's one thing for us to read and go like, yeah, that's real, and then it's another thing for kind of go like, how do I experience that? Knowing if I believe it's real, how do I experience that?
And yet, you and I have on this podcast talked about some experiences that we have had that are kind of outside of what we can explain in a very rational, naturalistic. We don't believe in a strictly enclosed box view of nature. So I mentioned to you too. So I was going to come back to this. That there's a quote by Tertullian that this idea of Christianity in Iran not being stamped out. You said the places where it seems to be hardest. Tertullian, writing in his Apologeticus, this is back in this late 2nd century. And it's a famous quote. We usually say that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. The quote's from Apologeticus 50, verse 13, and it is the later part of that book. He says, "The more often we are mown down by you, the more in number we grow. The blood of Christians is seed." So basically saying when those around us see Christians responding even to persecution and continuing to hold on to the faith, that it has a profound effect on others. So that's kind of what brings us full circle from both the story we told about, maybe the reason for some anonymity in the Gospel of Mark, for example, and this idea that standing firm in the face of persecution can make a difference in people's faiths. Was there anything else you wanted to say? I was going to.
No, it's very First Peter. Yeah. For when you think about some of those things.
I just sent you some things earlier, and you haven't had a chance to watch this. Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You saying First Peter? What were you going to say about it?
No, it just reminds me first of being like the exile. Living your lives in such a way that when they do arrest you, or that they don't have it, they don't have anything against you.
Right, and even we consider pure joy when you face trials of various kinds. Jesus went through trials. He went through persecution. He stood firm, trusted in God, and that's what we're called to. But I mentioned this phrase. We kind of become complacent in the West, and I think that's, again, people I believe are looking and they're yearning for something that gives them a sense of purpose and meaning. I was going to mention one more, and I can't believe I never shared this with you, and you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but just earlier today, I sent you a couple of videos by a guy by the name of Yasser Eric, and I just find him fascinating. I had never heard of him before, but Josanne and I attended the International Conference on Missions in Lexington, Kentucky last November, and he was one of the speakers, and it was the first night, and I'm just like, I was blown away. I'm like, wow, way to slow roll the ending or the beginning of the thing, but it blew me away. But he is an example. His testimony, and I'm not going to give you all of it because I do want to link a couple of these videos. There are a couple of sermons that and pretty much he tells his testimony. He was raised a Sudanese Muslim, and his life's goal became to become a part of the Islamic Brotherhood. That was what he wanted to do with his life. And I'm not going to go through the details, but in an incredible way, God impacted his life. And again, a couple of these things that we would be, like, I don't know, but a miraculous healing that he was witness to. And then later, he would say an audible voice of Jesus in some way speaking to him, led him to not only become a Christian, but also to become a Christian pastor. And his testimony is just incredible. He has now been made, I believe by the Anglican Church, a bishop, and his responsibility is over all of those Muslims who have converted to Christianity. So he has a really, one of the articles, if we get a chance to link it, we should. He has an interesting I want to say it's ministry, in that all of these different Muslims from these different countries that we're mentioning that are having these visions and becoming Christians, he is now the one who kind of guides them and helps them. And so it's a really amazing story, and I encourage you to check out. I was sharing after I heard him speak live, I was just blown away, like I said, and I was sharing his videos and his testimony with everybody. So I'm surprised I didn't share with you, Ryan. But
not to me.
Well, I figure you know everything, so no.
Oh my gosh. Way to take it from like this nice story about this guy to some
jab
kind
it
of
to you. You gotta do that.
Jab to the gut. Well, Brian, what?
On that note,
we're done.
I hope you've enjoyed this last episode of the Bible Bistro.
Yeah, no, just kidding. Well, I hope you're enjoying the Bible Bistro. I've got my work cut out for me for show notes for tomorrow. Yeah. But we'll have show notes for tomorrow.
What else do you have to do, right?
Yeah, I'll get the video, get the audio out. Nothing to do. But if you're enjoying it, you can go to thebiblebistro.com. There's a button at the top. You can support us there. We're looking at a couple of different options too as well. Maybe some written stuff that you could participate or support us in for just a couple bucks. But we really appreciate you listening. Share, and we hope you all have a great Easter celebrating the risen Lord.
And thank you, Ryan. Thank you for not being too offended by my sharp wit. My sharp tongue.
Yes, there you go. All right. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Ryan.
you, man. And we'll chat next Tuesday.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.